Hi everyone, welcome to the third lecture in Am I Free? So today we're going to be talking about compatibilist theories of free will and moral responsibility. So compatibilists are those who think that free will and moral responsibility are compatible with determinism. Now, you might have heard the term soft determinism being used. This is a view for a type of compatibilism. So the soft determinist thought that determinism is in fact required for free will and moral responsibility. So this view is often attributed to a philosopher called Hobart in a paper from 1934. He says that free will without determination is inconceivable. So to have free will and to be morally responsible for our actions have to be determined. Now, others may be sensitive to this view. They may think, no, actually, causal determinism is actually a requirement for free will and moral responsibility. Because here's the general idea, is that without determinism, nothing else is going to give us sufficient control over our actions. If you think back to the previous lecture, where we talked about the problem of present luck, and we saw how the sort of inherent luckiness of freely willed actions, according to the libertarian, could reduce or remove control, the soft determinist has a solution to that. So they say, well, if having sort of this libertarian free will or this possibility that things could go otherwise is something that would reduce or remove a person's freedom and responsibility for their actions, then one way to maintain that control and freedom and responsibility is to have actions be determined, and have actions being determined being a requirement on free will and moral responsibility. This view, though, has fallen very much out of favor with contemporary compatibilists. One of the main reasons it's fallen out of favor is that most compatibilists don't want to commit to causal determinism being true. The latest science at least seems to suggest that there is some indeterminism in the world. Whether it's anywhere close to human action is another question. But most compatibilists want their view to be compatible with science. They don't want their view of free will and moral responsibility to rest on some thesis about what the laws of nature are like. So instead of holding that determinism as a requirement of free will and moral responsibility, so that every freely willed and every responsible action has been determined, compatibilists rather hold that free will and responsibility are just compatible with causal determinism. So they hold that we'd have free will even if causal determinism turns out to be true. So let's now move on to consider a particular compatibilist account of freedom and responsibility. So the account we're first going to consider is the character account. What we're going to consider might be a quite crude version of it, but we're discussing it more for illustrative purposes. It gets across some certain key points about contemporary compatibilist accounts. So this kind of crude character account is often attributed to David Hume. People will often say that Hume is a proponent of it. His view might turn out to be a little bit more complicated than contemporary commentators make out. But in any case, since we're using this account just for illustrative purposes, that's not going to matter so much. So on this character account, the idea is that we have characters, preferences, and motivation. We have our character traits, preferences, and motivations. And that's who we are. Like when we think of each individual person, we boil down to character traits, preferences, and motivations. And that's it. There's nothing else beyond us. We're, of course, biological beings, but when we think about our capacity as psychological beings who have ability to act and reason in the world, all we really are our characters, preferences, and motivations. And the idea here is that given that we are our characters, preferences, and motivations, and any actions that issue from our characters, preferences, and motivations are our actions. And because they're our actions, we can be responsible for them. They're free actions, like they're what we want to do, and we are responsible for them. they have a source inside us. And this allows that there could be things which caused us to have the character we have. That is not supposed to matter. What's supposed to matter is just that we are our characters, and so we're responsible as a result. So notice that this denies a key premise of the basic argument, at least implicitly. So the basic argument holds that we have to be responsible for our characters' preferences and motivations, to be responsible for actions that issue from them. But the character account, as I understand it, is just saying, well, that's not true. We don't have to be. That's not how it works. If something issues from our character, then it's free and we're responsible for it. And that's the end of the story. There's further questions about how we got the character we got and who's responsible for the character we've got, if anyone is, but those are separate questions. What we care about is whether our actions are free and whether we're responsible for them. And they are, on this view, simply if they stem from our character's preferences and motivations. So the view here is that you are your character preferences and motivations, and all the actions that stem from them are free and responsible actions. So we take our little diagram. So suppose that we have Simon here, and he has the trait of greediness. And because he has the trait of greediness, he's often greedy. So through being greedy, he might steal food that doesn't belong to him to satisfy his greediness. And so when he commits the act of theft, this expresses or manifests or was motivated by his greediness. And so it's his action and he's responsible for it. He acted freely because it issued from his own greediness. Now, the character account, I think, has some plausibility on its face, but it has quite a few problems. One of the biggest problems is to do with the possibility of manipulation. So on this view, we are responsible and act freely if an action issues from our character's preferences and motivation. But there might be ways, at least hypothetical ways, that we might come to have a particular character trait or a particular preference or a particular motivation in which it wouldn't seem that we'd be acting freely or that we should be held responsible for actions that issue from such traits, preferences, or motivations. So here we might imagine a sort of science fiction case, the kind of case that comes up in certain types of film, such as The Clockwork Orange featured here, and you might have heard of in cases of brainwashing or hypnosis. And so whether such manipulation is really possible in this day and age isn't clear, but it at least seems possible that in the future, scientists could figure out a way to implant particular psychological states, such as beliefs or desires. Now, the way in which they could do this is perhaps they figure out the relevant parts of the brain to sort of stimulate, or they can implant a chip. You can imagine whatever you like, but we can at least imagine that we have these advanced neuroscientists, and they're able to, through using their advanced methods, to give people particular beliefs and desires, or even particular character traits, even particular preferences, particular motivations. And then we might imagine that we have a person who's implanted with a psychological state, and then they come to act from it. So if we have somebody who's implanted with a few psychological states, and this constitutes a character trait, and that person goes off and does something, the character account is going to say that this person is acting freely and is morally responsible for what they did. But it seems intuitive that a person isn't responsible for such actions, because the change of character that they've gone through, the change of preferences and motivation, is not the result of their own doing, it's the result of somebody else's doing. And it seems a bit odd or unfair to then say that, oh, this person's responsible. But even if we just focus on acting freely, rather than the questions of responsibility, it still seems counterintuitive to suppose that a person is acting freely when how they are acting is the direct result of having mental states or psychological states implanted by some other people. You might wonder, well, these are just science fiction cases. These don't really happen in real life. Why should we care about them? One of the reasons is that if we're trying to give an account of free will and moral responsibility, we want it to apply in all situations, not just our current situation. So it might turn out in the future that scientists can do this kind of sort of mental state implantation. They can implant beliefs and desires and values and so on. Now, if that's the case, then we want our account of free will and moral responsibility to be sensitive to that. And more broadly, we're not just thinking about situations that might be physically possible. We also want to deal with conceptually or metaphysically possible situations. We want to be able to say that, okay, so we're imagining this story in this fanciful world. Are these people acting freely and responsible? And if our account doesn't speak to that, then it's not going to be a sort of metaphysically acceptable account of free will and moral responsibility. But we want our accounts to be metaphysically acceptable. So we should at least permit these cases and see where they lead us. And a more general point here is that if we deny that we should consider science fiction cases, then we seem to be denying that we can't learn anything about morality or life or about existence through considering science fiction. But it's often a very good way in which people sort of come to revise their beliefs in a positive way about the world. So often science fiction abstracts away from real life situations to such an extent that it abstracts away from our biases. And so we can learn, maybe this course of action or this way of living is morally wrong. We can learn that perhaps what's essential to being a person is this or that. It seems like we've got good reason to consider these cases. So let's consider these cases, at least for the sake of argument, and see where it leads us. So let's consider another case to try and sort of hammer home the point here about manipulation. Suppose you have Beth. Suppose Beth is the kindest person you know. She's sweet and gentle and would never harm a fly. She's then implanted with a character trait and subsequently kills someone. Question is Beth acting freely when she kills this person? Like I said earlier on and suggested, this kind of action, because it results from manipulation, doesn't seem like a free action. It seems very counterintuitive to suppose it's a free action. But remember that the character account that we've considered so far says that this is a free action. So this gives us reason to think that the character account isn't giving us at least sufficient conditions for acting freely. If there's acting in character is required for acting freely, it's definitely not enough. We have to add more into it. So just to be clear here, that you've probably gone over these before, but when we say something's a sufficient condition, we're saying that one thing is enough for another thing. So X is sufficient for Y. So if you have X, then you have Y. So if having one ball is sufficient for having another ball, then if you have ball one, then you have ball two. So if you say acting in character is sufficient for free action, then whenever a person acts in character, then their action is a free one. And what we've basically seen as a counterexample to this sufficient condition, we've seen a sufficient condition, we've seen a free action, What we've basically seen here is a counterexample to the character condition considered to be a sufficient condition for acting freely. We've been given an action which is in character, but yet isn't a free action. So we've seen that acting in character is not, in fact, sufficient for a free action. If we think acting in character is a necessary condition for free action, we then have the burden of giving an account of what the other conditions of acting freely are. There are, though, other counterexamples to the character condition, one of which comes from the idea that we can act compulsively. So some phobias and disorders cause people to act compulsively. I want to add one word of warning here, is that often when philosophers discuss phobias and disorders, they do so in a way which doesn't really reflect how modern thinking thinks about them. So sometimes, for example, we discuss Frankfurt later on, he'll talk about people acting compulsively. through addiction, but his understanding of this is perhaps not accurate. It's perhaps a particular characterization which is now fallen out of favor. In any case, we can still make the general point that if a person acts in this way, then they might not be acting freely. So, for example, suppose a person has kleptomania and has a compulsion to steal. One way of characterizing this is that they can't help but steal. Any situation where there might be something to steal, they might well steal, and they can't stop themselves from doing it. So we can suppose that a recurring character, Simon, suffers from kleptomania. And you might ask, well, does he act freely when he steals? And I think it seems intuitive to many people that if you lack control over your actions, over the fact that you steal something, then you aren't acting freely when you do it. So if you have, say, this kind of disorder, or if you have a phobia, that means that you stay at home or you act in a particular way around, say, spiders or open spaces, then your actions aren't free ones because you've just got no way of controlling these overriding impulses to act in particular ways. One of the issues for the character account, however, is that somebody like Simon is arguably acting from his character preferences and motivation. Like, acting such that you steal compulsively could be considered an in-character action, something that you have a corresponding character trait that causes you to act that way. And if that's the case, this gives us another reason to think that acting in character is not enough for acting freely. And so acting in character is not enough for morally responsible behavior. So now, how well does the character account fare against the basic argument? So recall that the character account denies a key premise of the basic argument. It denies that we have to be self-creating, and then it denies that we have to be such that we're responsible for our own characters. So while the character account seems like it might be a promising response to the basic argument, the character account just has too many problems. If you wanted to undermine the basic argument, the character account can seem very alluring in doing that, because it basically says that Galen Strawson is wrong to think that we have to be responsible for our own characters, and rather we're just responsible for anything that stems from or issues from our characters. But given that it has so many problems, it's not going to help overcome the basic argument.